So last night, the United Nations Security Council, which has now become a talking shop, held another emergency meeting to discuss the latest slaughter of over 100 unarmed Palestinians by Israeli terrorists in Gaza. This was after Israeli terrorists bombed a school where hundreds of homeless Palestinians were taking shelter. Surprisingly, the UK took a strong stand. You can see the video here, and used incredibly harsh words to condemn Israeli action. But the infamous veto woman of America didn't disappoint us with more shamelessness, a word that I will be repeating quite a lot for her today in this video. Reacting to the bombing of a Gaza school, this woman said that Israel had an obligation to minimize civilian casualties. Flowery words. Just like America has an obligation to keep on supplying more lethal weapons to Israel so that the genocidal regime of Israel can kill more babies and children. Also, just like this veto woman, has an obligation to veto every resolution calling for a ceasefire and condemning Israeli brutalities. Just like she has an obligation to be a horrible human being.
The United States is deeply concerned about reports of civilian casualties following the August 10th strike by the IDF on the compound in Gaza that included a school and a mosque sheltering desperate, displaced people, including women and children. We have raised our concerns with Israel, and while they indicated they were targeting senior officials from Hamas and Palestinian Jihad, they have an obligation to do everything possible under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. We mourn every civilian lost in this horrific incident and in this conflict. But this much we do know and must be acknowledged. Hamas continues to gather and continues to operate out of schools with no regard for the well-being of civilians. Israel has a right to pursue Hamas. Israel has a right to respond to threats. But how it does that matters. We've said repeatedly and consistently that Israel must take measures to minimize civilian harm.
And the only time she supported a ceasefire, she was quick to clarify that this was a non-binding resolution on Israel. That's how shameless she has been all throughout in this conflict. Now, many people would say that she's only following the order from her bosses. No, she has a choice. She could have resigned in protest, but she has chosen not to do so. So therefore, her complicity is loud and clear. In her speech, this horrible woman then shared her fake concern for Palestinian victims, as if she cared about them. In private, I'm absolutely sure she would be laughing her heart out looking at the misery of Palestinian women, children, and babies. At least that's the impression you get by seeing her continuing defense for Israeli atrocities in the last 10 months. Not that the United Nations Security Council is relevant anymore. It lost its relevance long ago. I wouldn't take this woman seriously anyway. This woman's shamelessness knows no boundary. Or else, how would you utter these two things in one sentence? You need to have attained a doctorate in shamelessness to do this. She talks about the need to reduce regional tension, but proudly mentions how her country has just sent an aircraft carrier, a submarine, and other military assets to help Israel. Of course, this would be hugely helpful in reducing tension.
Colleagues, I cannot stress enough President Biden's view that it is time to bring immediate relief to the long-suffering people in Gaza and the long-suffering hostages and their families. The best way to do that is a ceasefire in Gaza with a hostage deal. The United States, alongside Qatar and Egypt, has worked tirelessly for months to forge the framework agreement on the table with only the details of implementations to be concluded. a framework based on the principles endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2735. Simply put, the deal needs to get done now. Now. As President Biden emphasized in a statement last week with leaders of Qatar and Egypt, and I quote, "There is no further time to waste nor excuses from any party for further delay. It is time to release the hostages, begin the ceasefire, and implement this agreement," unquote. We've called on both sides to resume urgent discussion on Thursday, August 15th, in Doha or Cairo to close all remaining gaps and commence implementation of the deal without further delay. As mediators, we are prepared to present a final bridging proposal, one that resolves the remaining implementation issues in a manner that meets the expectations of all parties. We welcome the statements of support for this effort, such as the one issued by Algeria over the weekend, and we call on every member of this Council to speak with one voice, to press Hamas to participate in the discussions on August 15th, and for both sides to agree to implement the deal on the table without further conditions or delays. A durable ceasefire could accelerate efforts to restore basic services, including electricity and water and sanitation, bringing much-needed relief to Palestinian civilians, many of whom have been displaced multiple times. It could enable an urgently needed vaccination campaign to stop the spread of polio, and it would facilitate the release of all hostages held by Hamas, including 8 Americans and citizens from many other countries. We also have been clear that a ceasefire in Gaza could help enable diplomatic efforts to restore calm along the Blue Line and reduce regional tensions. Indeed, from the start of this conflict between Hamas and Israel, the United States has worked to avoid a situation in which the fighting in Gaza spirals into a broader regional conflict. 4 months ago exactly, on April 13th, the United States worked closely with Israel and our partners in the region to repel Iran's unprecedented attack on Israel and stave off a broader conflict. Now we're once again in a moment of heightened threat. Consequently, the United States has taken needed precautionary steps, including moving an aircraft carrier group and additional air assets to the region so that should the situation arise again, we are prepared to defend Israel and U.S. military personnel in the region against any threats. But let me be clear, our deployment of additional military assets are not a prediction of what is to come. A broader regional conflict is not inevitable. The United States' overall goal remains to turn the temperature down in the region, deter and defend against any future attacks, and avoid regional conflict. That starts with finalizing a deal for an immediate ceasefire with hostage release in Gaza. We need to get this over the finish line. Again, we urge every member of this Council to say clearly and unequivocally that it is time to finalize and implement this agreement. Thank you, Mr. President.
Last night's meeting also saw an emotional and desperate speech by the Palestinian ambassador and utterly disgraceful conduct by the Israeli representative on his last day in office. You can watch the video here. What do you expect from a psychopath? Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so, because that's one of the many ways you can support independent journalism. God bless you all.